I'm Joseph. So this is a tent structure called Black Space, and I'm thinking about that that dilemma, that problem of declaring Black space as an artist to say like this space is for Black liberation, and that's the context, and otherwise, if you're not down with that context, you can't enter. Um, but it's also a mobile piece of architecture, and it's like um, calling back to the idea that the black school is mobile. We go where the students are, and historically, black folks, we haven't been afforded the luxury of monumental architecture. I was reading Fannin, and he said the colonists builds in steel and stone, but we kind of have to get in where we fit in. So I'm trying to call back to that, but also create a space that's a space of resistance specifically for Black liberation.
Um, I'm going to talk to you guys about what you see when you peek around the corner. Um, Also thinking about mobility, and mobility really in terms of access. We do go to where our students are typically. So this exhibition presented us the opportunity to be able to sort of idealize a classroom space. Um, so the color choices, the full sensory choices. We have things for you to smell, things for you to see, trees, plants, oxygen. There's about an 8-hour playlist in the space. And these posters that you see to the top are a continuation of work that I've been producing individually, but are really strongly minded towards a sort of new form of a classroom poster, reimagining those like motivational speech posters that used to be in the rooms that I studied in. And all of these elements are in the space of this hallway and throughout the exhibition to hopefully create an ideal environment for really clear thinking, for wellness. We're thinking about balancing emotional and physical wellness with the really heavy historical information and these complex theories that we're presenting and talking about histories of the African diaspora, right? It's a traumatic history. So how to balance the weight of all that information in a way that still can feel good and can feel comfortable, right? So the softness of the tent structure, of the cushions, of the color palette, which is kind of both cool and hot, right? Trying to, again, balance these elements together, create a sense of calm, but also a sense of urgency simultaneously. And then specifically in this hallway, we have our process deck, which we invite people to sit down and sort of work through. It's accompanied by a community survey that begins with the questions, what do you love about your community and what do you want to change about your community? And then you move through these 7 categories and sort of fill one in, fill in each of what you draw from this deck. And at the end, you sort of have a blueprint for a creative action that you can take and do in your own community. So these are some examples from that deck, and here's someone in that space, hopefully feeling optimally for really going through that process with the deck. Yeah. Kameelah's gonna tell you about her installation. Actually, gonna make you guys suffer. It's gonna be some history first. Hold on. There we go. Thank you. Hello. Alrighty. So anyone who knows me knows that I'm very enthusiastic about my city. So we're gonna start with my city because much of the history of my city informs the way that I make my work. It informs this entire exhibition. So I like to think about things that are hyper local. I grew up in a small town called East Palo Alto, which is in Silicon Valley. If you look at this lovely map here, you will notice Facebook.
the Four Seasons. My parents' house is literally about a 10-minute walk from Facebook. So there you go for context. So one thing that's really important in thinking about this body of work and this exhibition around social justice and education was mining from my hyperlocal experience to think about what examples of experiments in pedagogy and municipal building and institution building, and thinking about space that were intimate to my growing up and my experience and what I actually saw. So I'm going to sort of run through a couple of examples of things that I grew up in, the traditions I grew up in. The first one being from 1960 and the formation of something called the Nairobi Schools in East Palo Alto. And basically these came about because parents in the neighborhood saw how horrible the schools were and decided that instead of trying to what we were doing before, which was sending kids to local schools nearby through a sneak out program where you would use the address of a wealthier neighbor and then enroll your student in the school in that district, parents and families decided to actually start their own school system. They started a college system, and then as time went on, actually started an entire K through college system that was accredited and gave out actual degrees. Students transferred, and it was an entire system run by people who did not actually have funding from anyone other than private donors and some state funding. And so this is a spread from Ebony Magazine of an article that was written about the Nairobi schools back in 1971. And what's really exciting and important about this school is how mobile it was. They did not have a physical classroom often, so it happened in kitchens, churches, basements, corners. It was literally a school without walls. And when we say we created our own school system, I want to emphasize that this was an entirely Black-run, Black-organized organization in school that was one of the few and only in the nation at that time. And we were not even a city yet. So some other things that are important to think about with regards to building Black institutions and sort of issues around self-determination is that in 1968, our city attempted to rename the city Nairobi. We were unsuccessful, but we attempted, and this is part of another effort to sort of build a city that reflected a particular ethos and a particular way of being that was organized around not only having Black institutions, but naming the city after something that reminded people of the capability of having sovereignty over the land and the space that you're in. We also experimented a lot with literacy in libraries. We have the East Palo Alto Federal Library Project, which was a mobile library, and people didn't think this was going to work, but basically they got in the back of this minibus and folks drove around and people jumped in the back and read books. And it was a really exciting time in our city's history because, again, this is our city being very innovative and thinking about how do we experiment with the ways that we're disseminating information, sharing information, but more importantly, how do we, again, insert ourselves into this narrative? Instead of being passive about this, how do we actually create the things that we need? And I actually found this morning, which was like super exciting to me, and I didn't know about this. And I'm gonna have to go back to do some more corroborating research. But it's about the East Palo Alto branch of the Black Panther Party with their Community Survival Day. And so East Palo Alto is very close to Oakland and San Francisco, so we got a lot of the influence of the Black Panther Party and the radical movements that were happening there. And in fact, our Nairobi schools were often visited by Black Panthers who were excited about these innovations and these experiments in Black schooling. And then my parents. They're important to mention because they're my first example of thinking about education and innovation in these experiments. There are 5 of us. All 5 of us went to 5 separate schools. Some of us, and my mom drove us to school every single morning. God bless that woman. And what's exciting about her is that there was a point where my mom pulled my brother out of school. He was in the special ed classroom, began homeschooling him, and then I started helping her with homeschooling. And I actually watched my mom almost every single day go and fight with the school district about services, and just watching her process and saying that I actually don't want to take this anymore. I'm just going to basically start my own homeschool to give my kid what he needs, was really important for me to see as a model of these different scales of innovation and experimentation. And then there's me. So I come about in 1985. One of the things that's really exciting about my upbringing is that even though our city didn't have a lot of stuff, we did have a publishing center. And these were literally these mobile trailer parks that were stationed at our school in the concrete area of the playground. And during lunchtime, you could go in to them, and then you could give your story to this woman who sat and typed it and selected paper. and you could make books. And so before I left second grade, I had published almost a dozen books. I spent a lot of time in that publishing center, and I do actually feel like that is something that really transformed me, because it gave me a sense of pride about being able to create my own stories, but it also gave me a sense that I had the right to not only be a consumer of information, but to be a producer of information. And so the first about the author is when I was 6. I was much younger. I wasn't writing complex sentences yet. Their order is a bit off. But by the time I get to age 7, I'm writing my about the author with a bit more confidence. And I think that confidence had a lot to do with my parents and a lot to do with just this thing being in my school that said I had the right to write. So my name is Kameelah Rasheed. I'm 7 years old and I go to Flood School. 7 years old is very young, but I like to read, write, and do art. I live in East Palo Alto. I'm in the 2nd grade. I'm a good reader. And that assertion of being a good reader was so important to me, because I was like, I need people to understand that, like, not only am I just like making books, like I can read them and I can write them, and this was important to me as a young person. And so a lot of these ideas and these sort of legacies of experimentation with institutions show up in the installation and work that I'm going to talk about in a second. You guys have suffered through enough historical context. This is me. Most pictures are me with books. That was my favorite book. Almost every picture is with books. So in my practice, I'm really invested in thinking about the elements of history that have been footnoted, and then using my installation and my practice to actually sort of like expand or to elaborate. And so literally thinking about my city's history as a footnote in history, and the ways that I can use the installation and all of my other work as a moment of expansion. And so when I think about experiments in education and learning, I come back to this excerpt from Octavia Butler. She did an interview with Samuel Delaney back, I think it was 96 or 98. And he's asking her about the internet. She's like, I don't really deal with that. But she starts talking about this idea of primitive hypertext, which for her is her way of coming up with ideas and processing information, which is literally allowing herself to let her brain sort of process and float and drift. And that happens through looking at different books, exploring different things simultaneously, and allowing these ideas to sort of marinate. And so in framing the show and trying to think about an installation, I thought a lot about learning as a process of deceleration, of literally slowing down to process nuance, but also allowing yourself to build an ecosystem of ideas rather than trying to go on a didactic route with regard to what you're trying to learn. So instead of I'm trying to reach a standard and master X, I'm trying to go through a different rounds of learning and processing so that I can map the relationships between these ideas. And so I'm really interested in the encounter, that moment of interaction, that moment of exchange, that moment of unfolding. So now you get to see the work. So you've been to the 5th floor, and the resource room is the space that I work with. There are 2 things that are happening. The first thing is this space here, which is the library space, which includes about 150 pieces of printed material, which explore institutions, independent Black schools, independent Black publishing presses, and other things that are part of the lineage of Black textual production. This took about 10 months to sort of source all these materials, and I was really invested in thinking about including materials that were both hyper-local and also national, but also resources that in a traditional library or archival space would never rub up against each other. So like there's a publication from a Berkeley High School poetry group from 1971 that's right next to a Mary Baraka text. In a traditional library setting, you wouldn't see them next to each other, but I'm interested in these moments of juxtaposition as like a reminder of how these things can sort of collapse into space and occupy the same space, and how we can map relationships between things we don't normally think should be mapped together. And so I'm invested in like the entire space being readable and engaged with. So everything in the space can literally be touched and engaged with. The photocopier, you can make photocopies. The table, which I'll show in a second, is also a readable surface. Everything can be touched and engaged with, because I think about touch as a moment of interaction that allows for deeper learning. And I wanted to ensure that everyone had a chance to engage as fully in a sensory process as possible. So a couple of things on the table are these photocopies of advertisements from independent Black printing presses and magazines, which are under plexiglass so that there's another surface to read, looking down as well as looking up. There's also this fun excerpt from the FBI. There was a point where they were really scared about Black people reading books and having bookstores. And so this is an excerpt from a book talking about, and I'll remember the name in a second, talking about activist businesses. And there's an Atlantic article published about this, and I bought the book, but it's basically referring back to the moment of surveillance of independent Black bookstores, because they were scared of Black people learning about how terrible things were and then doing something about them. But this is a good reminder about sort of the fragility of independent Black institutions. There's also reading lists that are also there. Some are reading just like you would at the library. There's some are reading that's pulled from the collection that's in the library as well. Here are a few examples of some of the pieces that are in there. So everything from Ebony Juniors to these newsletters from anti-gentrification movements in Fillmore District in San Francisco back in the 60s to excerpts of Ebony magazine to just a range of things. Some more things. That orange book is the one from the Berkeley students. Oh, and the book is called The Head Shops to Whole Foods. Sorry. The last thing that I'll mention before I stop talking is the installation that's on the opposite wall. So traditionally my practice is looks like this. So I'll work in a space that's like 30 feet and sort of expand through that. And this time I was working with a smaller space, which was an exciting challenge for me because it challenged me to think about interaction opportunities for engagement and learning that happen on a smaller scale. And so a couple of things that are important to note about this is that everything was created through the Xerox machine. I had a residency at the Lower East Side print shop in 2015. When it ended, I still wanted to be able to do some type of printmaking, so started using the Xerox machine as a tool for printmaking, and then started doing a lot of research on the role of Xerox machines in radical movements, and was really interested in using the same register and tonality that radical movements use to make zines, flyers, and to democratically disseminate information to also make my work as well. And so everything is created through performing scores, literally on the bed of the photocopier, either through dragging things, introducing new forms of light, playing with duration to create these things, these stencils that are then mapped digitally and then reprinted. And I really like working in the register of sort of things that are collaged and cut out because they're a great nod also to a lot of the independent Black newspapers that sprout up as well, which were going in between screen printing and stenciling. And so I guess I'll leave on this last note here. Here's some like details of the work that's on the wall and thinking about this, creating these sort of like architecturally scaled collages in the space. Creating everything in this space where there's not a finite ending or a didactic message. And so there are many parts of this installation where there's a sentence that doesn't finish. There's a part where something's low down on the floor that you have to squat to see, but everything is an invitation to create meaning and thinking about radicalism and learning as the moment of deaccelerating to actually allow people to make and map their own connections to literally build their own knowledge ecosystem.
Okay, yikes. Great. I just want to thank Emily and Johanna for inviting me, but also Kameelah, Shani, and Joseph, I think, for these compelling projects that, really speak to social justice and creative education, but, the kind of role of what does it mean to actually make knowledge. And then as you see with both projects, and if you haven't been upstairs, I would encourage you, is to see the importance of the space of knowledge and what does that mean to both have a space of community, but also I think in both projects, and I've seen you also make space for individual engagement in material, and I really appreciate what you said, Shani, about the question of color, and about having a space to sort of deal with the kind of trauma, right, that in terms of what it means to be Black or a person of color in the world, in the modern world. And so what I thought I would do is maybe sort of state the problematic and then, sort of as a historian, maybe give some examples that will clearly relate, I think, to many of the things that your projects address and maybe some questions that we might think through together as we have our back and forth. But I think it's important to think about the production of knowledge both as a psychological space, but also as a physical space, the ways in which the mind and body are both interactive, and what does that mean, especially given the question of trauma, like how does it become a space of healing and also empowerment? So how many people had a Dick and Jane reader when they were growing up? And this will definitely date your age. Yeah, all of us over 50. So I want to show something that was about, it was a really important part of a project that I did for my final project in graduate school when I was finishing up my master's in architecture, and it was about representation. And some of you may recognize it. I know Bob O'Mealy knows exactly where this comes from. But yeah, this is a classic Dick and Jane narrative, right? You know, here's the house, it's green and white, it has a red door, it's very pretty, here's the family, mother. So it's constructing that space, right, of the heteronormative white family, right? This is an interesting move. The move is critical, right? Because it's about the rules that structure relationships. Punctuation and capitalization gone, right? So what is our experience of that? You know, it becomes much more difficult to find the meaning, to see where things begin and end, to begin to understand how the accumulation of words structure what is being conveyed, how knowledge is actually produced through engagement. We'll go to the last one. And I love this because this squeezes out what's called the white space, right? And it becomes illegible. It becomes gibberish, madness, right? And for me, that's that space, the spacing, right? The space of where you find the word, where you breathe, where you know, like for me, this was mind blowing, right? You know, I'm an architecture student, like looking at this stuff, like, oh my God, it's all about representation, black marks on a white page, and so it helped me understand the malleability of these systems that we inherit, and then how one can develop a kind of poetic, creative response to the malleability of those systems that structure meaning and knowledge, right? Where does this come from? Who knows? The Bluest Eye, exactly. Yeah, and it tells the story of a young girl who's 9, who's learning. This is how she's learning the world. This is how she's trying to see the world, except in her reality, you know, there is meanness, there is violence, there is rape, there is incest. That is not the world in which her physical body is in, and yet this is the world in which her mind is being trained, right? And so she has a psychotic break precisely because of the racialized condition of knowledge. I mean, Stuart Hall says it well, racialized knowledge has the power to organize everyday conduct, right? So I really, really learned a lot from that, and it made me think back to my own history, right? Like my own book. This is my book. This was my primer. This is before we read. This is before we have words, right? What are the images telling us, right? So, I mean, I just, yeah, this is exactly the thing that I had when I was growing up, right? And especially if you look at the lower right-hand corner, what does that tell you about like gender roles of what the women are doing and what the men, and the way in which there's a kind of miming, right? In which there's a kind of education going on in the space of the domestic, right? And even, you know, like the little girl on the left has the car, right, which is mirroring the family car. So we learn this way of being in the world through things that sometimes just seem quite innocent, right? So knowledge is really, really, really power. So that question, like the books, I mean, I think that's, you know, in Kameelah's work, like the ways in which the production of knowledge, how do we make books, how do we produce that is really critical. And also the question of black space, like where do we and how do we produce the space? So I wanted to sort of show, this is Hampton Institute. These are Francis Benjamin Johnston's photographs of the early days of Hampton. And it shows you the kind of rigor of discipline, right? That was about turning the enslaved black into the dutiful citizen. That was the project of the white beneficiaries of Hampton. Booker T. Washington went to Hampton and then later started Tuskegee. Booker T. Washington had this idea that the students would actually build a school. That led to a project that he started around 1910, funded by the philanthropist Julius Rosenwald, the Rosenwald schools, right? And I thought these were really kind of remarkable. This is in the teacher training school, the normal school training at Hampton. This is another Johnson, right? And the ways in which the kind of regiment and the way in which the body is being organized within systems of sociability. So Washington, you know, it's a very successful project. Washington produces this in his, at Tuskegee. One of the first licensed black architects, Robert Taylor, who goes to MIT, actually works on this. And they kind of produce this booklet that gives instructions to black communities on how to build schools. Now, it literally will go through and it'll tell you how many nails you need, what kind of wood, paint, how to build a privy, landscaping, like all of the how-tos for how to construct. Precisely because African Americans had I'll say piss poor schools, right? They were ramshackled, falling down. And Washington realized, no, that we have to actually produce that system of education ourselves, because clearly the government's not going to 100% produce this for us either. And so literally it was about putting blacks to work, self-determination, to build their community schools. And these manuals became a kind of how-to for how to do that. And people were very proud of the schools. And you could see in this one in Welsh, Louisiana, Rosenwald gave $300, the Negro patrons gave $1,100. Now the arrangement was supposed to be 1/3 Rosenwald, 1/3 the state or local school board, and 1/3 African Americans, but the African American communities had to raise, in a lot of cases, most of the money in order to build the schools. Even though they paid taxes, they nonetheless also had to pay money for their schools. So that's problematic. However, I mean, the system was incredibly successful, building over 5,000 schools by the time the program ended in the mid-1930s, which was a kind of pretty radical, in terms of like, all right, how are we going to build it? And a number of very well-known people were educated in these Rosenwald schools. They started building large high schools, brick schools. I mean, it really fueled a sort of process of building the backbone of the Black educational system in the South. So it was very, very important. But let's move up a little forward, and this definitely connects with what Kameelah was saying. If you look at the Black Panther Party platform, a number of the issues that they were dealing with was police violence, housing, food, access to education, and one of the key ones was the question of how to educate the Black youth in that moment. What I think is remarkable, this is the Black Community Survival Conference. This was in Oakland, March 30th, 1972, was the ways in which, exactly what Kameelah was talking about, harnessing the system that was already there, building the system, right? Taking the system over. So the question of healthcare, doing sickle cell anemia testing, food distribution, which was also critical. This was part of that, but also education, how to bring up the youth in a system that addressed Black history, talked about white supremacy, dealt with the question of racial trauma, and really produced an educational curriculum that, in fact, enlightened and raised a new, aware population. One of the schools actually took over a former church, and so this is the Oakland Community School that was called originally built as the Calvary Temple. This is open from 73 to 84 in East Oakland. And as you could see, a number of very important people came in and visited. There's Rosa Parks, there's Maya Angelou, you see Huey Newton. And so this became a long-term project of education in terms of the ways in which students were going to be educated, taught, and advanced through the system. And again, a number of the students did really remarkably well, becoming politicians, themselves educators, and really pillars of the community. And again, it drew national attention. And this, again, just like the Rosenwald school system, this school system also became a model with a number of the things being adapted actually into the national educational system. Right. And so I think the schools that I just showed, along with the Morrison quote, and this is David Hammons' famous flag, show how Black Americans have appropriated and also transformed symbols, artifacts, places, and also systems, often of racial oppression, into productive sites of Black life. So one of the things that I think might be critical to think about together is like, what tactics of resistance or refusal to racism can we deploy in knowledge system, and what would those spaces of knowledge be? How do we rework, rewrite, repurpose, reinvent, reimagine through pedagogical practices? What do these spaces, psychological and physical, look like? Thank you.
Where do we go from here?
Question. Hi. I'm happy to ask questions of this group, but I have a feeling that you have questions for each other. to begin? No? It's a lot too.
Yeah, I mean, I'm wondering. Yeah, I mean, I think it maybe goes back to the question of black space that you started with. And how, I think in both of your cases, working within this institution, working within museum, like what were the tactics in creating that black space within the museum, right? Because the museum has again, it's a system, has a legacy, it's racialized. Historically. And so what were the strategies that you both use? I know color was certainly one, the ways in which you hang things on the wall. But can you be more specific about like, all right, what is black space and how are you transforming it?
Hi again. One of the things that, and we were speaking about this a little bit before, all these cases of Black people just existing in the world and people calling the police because they think that they shouldn't linger or be there anymore. And so, in my practice, one of the things that's really important to me is thinking about duration and how long people literally can stay and linger in a space. And so, in designing the resource room, I wanted to create as many opportunities for unfolding and actually sitting and engaging and enduring through that space as possible, as a literal invitation, like you can stay here. You can stay here to make photocopies. You can stay here to eat. Well, not eat. You can stay here to chill with your water. You can actually be here and occupy the space because there are so many spaces, particularly in museums and gallery spaces that don't feel welcoming, that I wanted to literally construct a space that was an invitation to hang out and to engage in that process. And by having lots of text and having text that's literally in book form, text is on the wall, text is there, fabric that can be felt, that can be laid on. People laid on it a lot, which is why the Velcro keeps coming up. It's a whole other thing. Really thinking about what are the expectations and what are we inviting people to do when we ask them to come to museums. I learned a lot through tactile engagement, being able to touch things, and the most important thing for me in the space was that even if a kid came into the space, he would never actually feel like I can't touch anything in the space. I wanted to feel welcoming, and I wanted to feel like a multi-sensory moment of engagement. And I know that a lot of times when you come into spaces, that isn't always the invitation, that isn't always the allowance or affordance.
Yeah, I think that idea of comfort, again, we use all of these soft materials and just thinking about the schools that we typically go into through the Black school, through working for years as teaching artists, there's so much concrete, right? There's just so much concrete. And even, kind of in preparation for this show, studied what classroom teachers are doing in the direction of innovative design right now. And people are really trying to do the things, but it's still within the confines of that old order and that old space, and you're like working with the furniture that is brought in from the department. So what happens when you just cast all of that aside? And that's kind of how we came up with the materials that we did and things that can move to fit different spaces.
Yeah, yeah. Thinking about black space, I'm specifically like at the moment interested in self-determined black spaces. So not just can black people come and be, but can black people say you can't come and be. This is just for us at this moment. So yeah, the tent closes, and I've closed the tent on people, and they wonder like, why are you closing the tent? And so it is like this experiment, this exercise. Like obviously, it's made out of fabric. Anyone could walk into it if they so please. But even that moment of somebody defying black space, like going into a black school against the people who've constructed that space as well, or a black church, or whatever it may be. Like we have this history of even with the black bookshops, people seeing them as like dangerous or inherently threats, inherently radical. Um, like the fact that Black Panther headquarters got shot up, the the breakfast programs got burned, like whenever we establish our spaces, those spaces, and our spaces specifically for us, those spaces are just inherently seen as threats. Um, and yeah, thinking about that, the complicated idea of schools and black folks and black schools and how there's a lot of black schools, but are they self-determined black schools? Like, do we get to say what the school is, what the school teaches? And for the most part, we don't. At the same time, when the people who get to say what the school is and what the school teaches have demonstrated they're not interested in educating black people. So, so like in constructing the classroom space, we're thinking about holding all those complicated histories in mind, but also making it so people could just lay down and be comfortable, you know?
Really trying to be direct. I mean, I think that's the name of the project, The Black School, is very clear. It eliminates any confusion. It eliminates any need to kind of have to backtrack or explain. We all know what the context is here. Um, and oh my gosh, I'm losing my train of thought.
You got it.
um, I have to come back to it. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I'll limit this. Many things are coming to mind. I think one of the things that I think about a lot when we think about black spaces is often referred to in the singular. And I think that every black space isn't a comfortable or welcoming space for all black people. And so thinking about the wide permutations of lived black experiences and ideas around black utopia, and around self-determined black communities and what does it mean to actually create a black community, but also to create variations in different moments of agility for that community to change over time in response to the people who are coming and moving in and out of the space. And so there's, I think some people know about this book, Black Utopia, which is talking about all these different experiments in community building. And one of the things that's really interesting about that book, even though I have my own questions about the book, is the way in which a lot of these communities are really being formed out of literally what the community is talking about as a particular need. So if you think about something like Seneca Village, which was at Central Park, if you think about something like Weeksville, which is in the Crown Heights area, both of those coming out of a very hyper local specific need of those black people versus a universal national idea of what black people need. And so also thinking about responsive spaces as being classroom and learning spaces, spaces that are literally responding to the people that are coming into them, and thinking about how do we work with architecture in both the physical and also in the psychological sense to be responsive. And also this also is making me think a lot about comfort in relation to being fugitives and opaqueness also. So there's a lot about being present in the world and being self-determined in a very public way, but I'm also interested in the private ways in which black people have been self-determined, in ways that privacy and being very stealthy and avoiding surveillance actively are important for maintaining an institution. So there are things that obviously schools that started during enslavement that were able to sustain themselves because they were in secret, or maroon societies that were able to sustain themselves because they were in secret. Institutions and movements that were able to sustain themselves because they were secret. So thinking about ways in which we can move between publicness and privateness as a political strategy to think about sustainability of our institutions, particularly in the context of increased optic awareness where everything needs to be shown or represented. What does it mean to be covert? What does it mean to be a bit withholding? What does it mean to be a bit reticent as a literal strategy towards sustainability?
So, yeah, I have a follow-up question on that. I'm just talking to this thing. I have a follow-up question because what I think is also interesting about both of you, and also the fact that you were both brought here for the summer together, is that you are educators, but you use these sort of creative mediums as an educational platform. So my question for you is, in terms of your pedagogy, what is the importance of teaching creativity? But more importantly, what's at stake in stimulating the imagination? Why is that important?
All of that. In order to work towards a greater future, we have to imagine it, right? And in so many cases, especially as Black people, we have so little example, right? The example was washed away. The images that you showed, it's not unlike the Native American schools. It's really cultural genocide, right? So we're been stripped of all these cultures and taught to honor and value all of these things that are dishonoring and disvaluing us. So really the first step of the work, whether you call it art or activism, is to first create a vision of it, right? But then how do you even do that if your context is so conditioned towards this factory model that we're all kind of coming out of? So yes, that's the foundation of my studio practice, art making, and then it absolutely transitions into any public engagement, which is often coming in the form of teaching. Um, Sharing work first opens, sharing work that I've made first, right, can open up students to seeing where I'm coming from. That can spur all of these conversations, um, and and from there, um, from there, I'm sorry. Say what you're gonna say.
Imagination.
Yeah.
Well, I think here in America, like, we don't necessarily have a model of a nation that loves black people, or you know, yeah. So imagination is necessary to even get to the end goal, because that's what we want, you know. So we have to start with our imagination, and yeah, that's where radicalism lies, you know, at the moment. Um, I think, I don't know, I'm thinking about Black Panther, the movie, not the political organization, and how, I mean, it's a Marvel movie, you know, it's all about imagination, but they can't imagine a world that doesn't demonize Black radicalism. So what does that mean? You know, like that. Even in imagination, there's limits in that. Like we can't even think about, you know, what a Black nation that is like, not just like about um, this individualism, you know, but that is about collectivism. That is about diasporic collectivism, and not just uh, like this geography based nationalism. So yeah,
Can you repeat
even
that question?
imagination
I'm
is
really sorry to
complicated.
ask. If do you have it written down? It was just so much that I wanted to get to with it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I was just interesting because I think, you know, as somebody who teaches,
Yeah.
right, and I teach creativity, one, it's a very intimate thing to teach someone to be creative because you have to tap into a lot. Stuff
Yeah.
sometimes you don't even want to know. But also, I think it's really important to like to teach imagination. I think part of the problem. I mean, I don't teach it. In the school system. You know, high schools and junior high and grade schools. But art's not taught much anymore, right? And it seems like that's robbing people of
Right.
something really important.
Mhm.
So like, what's invested in teaching imagination?
Yeah, I think the thing I wanted to say, and I'll just get to it quickly, is that there is this natural relationship between these histories and this whole concept of art therapy, right? We don't have to just be dealing with form and color and those principles of art making. We can bring all of that and pair it with working through these really complex issues that must be worked through, that are not typically being addressed in the standard school day. And we have this capacity to get into these things, kind of to go around corners as teaching artists, as visiting artists, as after school programs, right? All of these slightly looser models allow us to get into the topics that may not necessarily being addressed. And it just goes hand in hand that at the same time we're handing over those topics and these histories, we're also handing ways of thinking about them that are also therapeutic, that are also literally meditative, repetitive processes that can help soothe us as we do it. Yeah.
I wanted to pull back for a second to even to just think about imagination, um, as like a basic human need, like the inability to be allowed to think about yourself and project it into the future. And so I think a lot about imagination being literally being able to project and see yourself in the future, literally being able to project and see your community in the future, literally being able to project and see people who look like you in the future. And so how so much of that is robbed from young black children, like when they are young, like not, we're not talking about 15, 16, 17 when they're in high school, but those opportunities to think about yourself as a future being that exists in tomorrow, being an opportunity that's foreclosed to them. So I think about imagination at a very basic level of that is an assertion of the right to be here, an assertion of the fight to be here, right? And so I think when I think about the role of imagination in the way that I work and the way that I work with students in school, quick back, I worked for a long time as a high school history teacher in traditional classroom settings, and also did museum education, and now work on the other side of things, which is designing curriculum. And it's been interesting to sort of travel between these different poles of education from the systems level to like being with students. And the one thing that I've noticed a lot by the time that students get to 15 and 16, literally asking them questions about what they want to do or what's possible, there's a very clear difference between a 16-year-old and the way that they express and articulate that from like a kid who's 2 or 3 who may not have been exposed to like the horrible rigors of the world. And so how do we allow for kids who are 16 and 17 to literally be able to be that excited about life, to be able to project themselves, but also how do we as adults who have also seen all the horrible crap that happens in the world still have the desire to imagine? And I think that we have tons of examples, even coming from maroon societies that were formed out of the literal imagination of projecting myself into the future of freedom and being able to build that. And so because I taught history a lot of the time that I spent was actually working with students with primary sources to think about, here are these examples of people who not only imagined in the psychological space, but also started to use that imagination as building blocks towards something. So I like to make use a lot of historical examples as Shani's point about things being washed away as a reminder that these things actually happen, that the things that you're imagining or working towards are not fictional, they're not so aspirational that you can't achieve, but they've been done and they can be done again. So I think there's importance around repetition, anchoring everything that students are engaging with in a historical example to say this is not fake, this is like real, like you can achieve this too. And I think the last point is just referring back to the quote from Octavia Butler about primitive hypertext. One of the things that I have tons of anxiety and frustration about with regards to like learning and the ways that so many things happen in classrooms is there's always this momentum towards a standard, a momentum towards learning a particular skill and then showing mastery of that skill through a very specific testing means that doesn't actually allow for a student to elaborate or explain themselves in a wide variety of ways. And so the Octavia Butler quote around primitive hypertext is important to me because it says that the important thing about learning is not that you master a skill, but is that you start building worlds. Like you literally are building an ecosystem of things and how they're connected. And so for me, I think creativity can happen in an art classroom, but can also happen in a history classroom, in an English classroom, where you're literally equipping students with the skills to start building worlds for themselves, to understand that this thing about this particular invasive species is connected to this thing that I'm learning over here about slave ships, that's connected to this thing over here that I'm learning about frogs. Like all these things are connected, and what are the interdisciplinary opportunities that we provide to students in real authentic, repetitive ways for them to like think about themselves as part of a future world.
So do you guys have questions for each other, or should we just open it out? I'm sure there's some questions out there in the audience.
I'm curious to see.
This has been fascinating, wonderful. I was curious about, in the Black school, you give out these forms to help ascertain the trauma, I guess, or the discomfort. And then I wondered of the student, you're trying to gauge things, I guess, and I wonder how you deal with, what ways in which you might deal with the psychological problem that you see in that particular student.
I don't think that's the goal to get at a trauma. I mean, I mean, if you talk to black people long enough, you're probably gonna get to some trauma. But the goal is to like outline a process for students to engage with their own community, you know? Um, so the survey is not necessarily for us. Survey, I think, is the wrong language, and we've been talking about that. But it's more so for the students to design a project for themselves in their own community,
Yeah.
to identify a issue that they want to change or they want to address in their community, and have a process that is open to get at it. So they get a bunch of different principles, they get a bunch of different tactics, they get a bunch of questions to stimulate thinking on these principles and tactics, and yeah.
Yeah, the reason it's called the community survey is because we initially began workshops working with students by asking these questions. What do you love about your community? What do you want to change about your community? So direct questions about community. And then students would make work from there. We're interested in working in that way so that everything feels local, that things feel attainable, right? That goes into helping to manage the latent trauma that is present in all Black American people in general, Black people in general. To make things feel attainable, to Kameelah's point of showing real world examples of people that have figured out how to make things work. So starting locally. Then we developed the process deck as a way of getting more directly um, at the issues and of helping to tease out the ideas. A really great example came up with one of the students just on Tuesday. We have the opportunity to work with these students for a little bit longer. So we were just going through the process deck, just looking at the principles and asking them like, which of these look confusing? Which of these look like something that might be something that's happening in your community? And a student pulled out the card for environmental justice, which that term is ultimately thinking about like, factories and poor communities emitting toxins, right? But the connection she made was to people littering in the neighborhood, right? And they're absolutely related. And by having that card there, now we don't just have to talk about littering, we can also talk about the broader societal situation, right? So we developed the deck to have a way of teasing out and having deeper, richer conversations and hopefully making deeper and richer work. And in turn, they do help to sort of sort the thoughts out because it can be so overwhelming, right? There's so much to think about here. So to have, and it's also everything's here on the internet. You can Google things, but that's kind of an overwhelming project also. So to have a physical set of information in a room that we can touch and feel and pass around and read and reread, I think is also a tool to help to deal with the sort of overwhelming sense of our circumstance.
Hmm. Yeah, just to hop in like the littering conversation. It started there, but it went to all these questions like, why do people litter? Well, maybe they don't feel ownership of their own community, and
Exactly.
why they don't feel ownership of their own community. And we talked about colonization, like the black community functioning as a colony within a nation. Yeah.
Thank, thank you for talking. I have a question, and it is how do these pedagogies exist outside the school? Because we are imagining and reimagining learning, and I'm trying to understand and in creative ways. And we're talking about responding to a space, responding to the architecture and people entering the space, and you also talk about mobility. So I'm curious to how uh, how these go from a space of learning that is a structure to into living into houses and family and relationships and things.
I
Thank you.
think one thing that is super exciting to me, and I think I learned this when I was a kid because I was pulling bark off of a tree across the street from the hospital my dad worked at. And I was pulling it off, and there was a moment where I asked my dad, I was like, oh, can trees feel? Like, is it like pulling off skin of a human? Like, does a tree hurt? And in that moment, my dad kind of laughed at me, but then sort of like sent me on my way to go do research on my own, which is why I think I like research because he never answered my questions. He just sent me, he was like, go figure it out. But that wasn't a classroom setting, right? That was like me at a tree at a park across the street. And so I think that every space can be a learning space as long as the situation is set up to actually encourage that encounter, right? And so anytime that you actually encourage or promote an opportunity for inquiry rather than giving a closed response or not responding at all becomes a learning opportunity. So I think a lot about in anything that you're doing, even if you're on the train and you're taking kids to a field trip to the Met, like that's an opportunity also for learning. If they're asking a question, if they're trying to figure something out, that actually being a moment to pause to say, like, what improvised learning opportunities are available here. So I think that being open to questioning and receiving questions and sending them on that inquiry arc, that's one thing. When I first moved to New York, there's a book that I bought from Strand Bookstore. It was called The Third Teacher, and it was talking about architecture as the third teacher. So you have like the people in the space, and you have the books, but the third teacher is always architecture. And they talked about having these school buildings where you could literally see water running through pipes. You could see chairs that have like things exposed, so that kids are implicitly learning about how things are made and how things function. And so I think that even as people, again, walking and engaging with space, thinking about, again, opportunities to ask questions, but also like being able to think about having a class that is outside with the purpose of asking questions about how things are functioning, how things are working, I think are really important. But I think the thing that I do want to emphasize that literally any space or opportunity can be a learning opportunity if you choose to make it such. If you choose to engage in that moment with that person, it can be such. And I guess the last example that I'll provide is in the back of an Uber pool. I was riding with this young kid named Travis, and Travis was super excited. He like nudged me a couple times because he's very bold. And he was like, "Hey, where are you going?" And I was like, "First of all, who are you? But second of all, I'm headed home." And so on that ride home, him and I had this long, he was like 6, had this long conversation about where I was going, what a nephew is versus what a cousin is. And so this long conversation that neither of us intended to get anything out of, but it was an encounter that we both consented and opted into because we chose to engage in that. So thinking about those moments to opt in to learning versus foreclosing yourself to those opportunities.
Thank you, y'all. My name is Akira. Y'all did such a great job. So I have like 2 questions in one type of thing. So I guess my first question is just that I'm still sitting with the whole museum institutional access. Like I'm a person where I always go to First Saturdays in Brooklyn Museum because it's free. And I just know that there's like a membership fee to get into this museum. So I think for me, I'm really trying to unpack like what did that institutional conversation look like for y'all in figuring out what does a radical access look like? Or is it like a thing where like only POC folks or Black folks are allowed on this 5th floor free every day whenever they show up in a museum? Some type of conversation of like what does that institutional role look like with the new museum in really prioritizing who has access in the room. And also one pointer too, I think I visited upstairs and I saw when the tent was closed and I saw people peeking in and I was like, wow, people are very forward about still seeing and witnessing what's inside the tent. And the next question that I have is that I'm sitting with the whole thing with comfort and softness. So for me, I'm within the urban planning background also and the architecture background. So I've lately been trying to rethink radical softness and what does that look like? So I'm just thinking of the juxtaposition with softness and comfort being in an institutional space. And the reason why I bring that up is like even now, if you look at NYPD, they have this whole thing of like using that same aesthetic of softness as their forward in getting the community to like them more. So lately their cars have been like golf car size, soft, curvature. It hasn't been looking like the traditional type of NYPD cars. So even with that, like they're using that whole element of softness in their approach. So thinking of the museum, of it being an institutional space of violence, and also knowing of like, I'm often like, yeah, soft is the way to go, but how do you also grapple just with softness and how it's also used in spaces of violence to invite people, to lure people in, but yet it's a trap. It's like they come in, they see that it's soft, but yet there's still these layers of like access and other issues that maybe this institution as a museum may not address, but use softness as like a luring trap. So I just want to know, with those two questions, how do you work through that with your art? And yeah.
I like those questions.
I'm It's particularly in this work, one thing I think I haven't mentioned yet is Black style and how radical Black style has been like um, sanitized of all of its radical politics and just used as an aesthetic, oftentimes to talk about capitalism, to promote capitalism. So that's something I'm thinking a lot about and trying to call to mind with the works in the exhibition, like saying, okay, if this is a powerful tool that people respond to, I'm going to take that back, and I'm going to use it to infuse it back with the radical style. So, like, I'm making in the front of the tent, there's a bunch of pictures. There's Huey, there's the kids in Liberation Schools, and then there's Che in the middle, and they all have the berets. So I'm trying to make that connection. Like, look how this style has been used to teach about revolution and radicalism across the diaspora. So that's one thing, and I'm also thinking a lot about reforms the system, reforms to policing, and how like we often get like kind of like hoodwinked into thinking that it's better, but anything that reforms the system extends the life of the system, you know? So if white supremacy is a little more comfortable, then it's gonna live longer, So we have to keep that in mind, that we don't want to make it a little bit better for a few people. We want to think about imagine a whole nother system altogether.
Yeah, we want to think about those things, but at the same time, we're existing in the same continuum that Blackness has always existed in, with HBCUs, with segregated schools. We're always still operating, even if you're not in the museum institution, you're operating in the United States, which is a giant.
Capitalism, which is global.
Right. Yeah. You're operating in wider spaces of white supremacy. So yeah, they're absolutely key to think about. Joseph talked about the imagery, and I do think that that's an important element of this balance that we're trying to create. Really direct, clear imagery. You know the traditions that we are referencing. You know the contemporary conversations that we're trying to have just by seeing the imagery that is present, that is the photography that's collaged into the works through various means. You also see the original source material is there's like a bulletin board / student work wall that's in the space where we pull photographs from to work with in workshops with the students, and then later that the students work through workshops with the public, which leads to one answer to kind of how we try to navigate your question of working with the museum and access. So I want to say first, because we're trying to get people out, that Saturday we begin the most public workshop that Joseph and I are actually leading, a series of workshops, which are called the Black Love Committee. They'll be the next 3 Saturdays, and they'll culminate at the festival that we're holding at Sugar Hill Children's Museum on August 19th. And it's open to adults and families. So if you have small children that don't kind of age into typical Black school programming, that's the opportunity. And the idea is that that group will sort of self-design a creative action that will take place either at or adjacent to the festival. So we're really especially trying to get an uptown audience, a Harlem community, to be a part of that, to do something that is meaningful to that neighborhood. And so that festival doesn't feel like a thing that's just happening there, but a thing that people have fed into. So we're working on that in collaboration with this festival that we sort of independently put on every year, that we're putting on this year with a museum in Harlem, a museum that is directed by a Black woman, that is in conjunction with a building, an organization that does housing for completely affordable housing for low-income people, even formerly homeless. So that is one way that we try to tie the sort of downtown museum opportunity and support for work with communities that we live with and really work with. Our youth programming is actually private, and it's actually with the museum's TAP program, stands for Teen Apprenticeship, but it's mostly dominated by summer youth employees. And through school partnerships that I've worked on and summer programs that I've worked on in the past, I know the population of summer youth employee programs is POC students throughout New York. So I was like, cool, they're signed up. We know that that's a core group that makes sense for us to work with. And so, yeah, we just came into it really clear on all of those dynamics and tried to figure out the way to best access the populations that we want to work with. The last thing that I wanted to say is that we also have sort of built in a situation where the students become teachers, which is important for pedagogy in general, but especially for radical pedagogy, because we know this information isn't transferred in schools. So whatever you learn, you have to be willing and able to share it and pass it on. And so by having the students teach lessons that we first teach them in the public settings on Fridays later in the week, that means that they get to have that experience, and we don't ever have to direct Black school energy towards whoever shows up at the downtown museum audience, right? We just thought really clearly about how to make that work.
Yeah, and typically the Black school is a couple backpacks full of art supplies and going into youth organizations and public schools and teaching workshops with them. So, yeah, that's typically how we move in and out of institutions.
I can. One thing that was interesting about your question made me think a lot about agility again and what agile design looks like. Because I think, and you can please correct me if I'm wrong. Part of the question is how do we create authentically radical spaces in institutions that are not, that's not just not the literal what they're built for. And I would just say that it just doesn't happen, right? Like it didn't happen this time, and it's not to be a dismissive critique of the work, but it's a recognition of the realities and the parameters of what you can do in the space, right? Like we couldn't open the entire fifth floor to make it free all the time to anyone who wanted to come through because they're institutional parameters. And so when I think about agile design, one of the things that's important for me is thinking about each of these as different moments. This being one moment in the iteration of the project, and that the next iterations don't actually have to look like this. Like this served a very particular purpose, and we are getting very interesting audiences. And the one audience that I think is quite understated and unacknowledged audience are the security guards. I spend a lot of time talking to the security guards. I don't know if Timothy's here. Shout out to Timothy if he's around. But I have known Timothy since 2016, and all the security guards are just amazing because they've like become deeply invested in the space, either from making sure my books don't get stolen, to like reading the books themselves and like telling me about the books they read or telling me about which books were most popular and what people were doing in the space. And so I think that while we weren't able to open up the fifth floor to everyone all the time, I think it is very important that the staff that has to be here because they're feeding their families and want to be here because they would leave, if, or whatever. Because people are here and they're spending a lot of time on these floors, that there's actually something for them to engage with, something for them to do, something for them to read, something for them to actively be involved in is really important to me. And so I do really want to think about, even within the restraints, what are the possibilities within those restraints? And I think being able to engage with the museum staff has been really, really amazing. And getting to know people and learning people's names and knowing about people's families has been an interesting moment. So thinking about this as like one very specific moment in like a long network of iterative parts of this project. And one of the things I think about with regard to radical access is that a lot of these really amazing programs happen in spaces like New York City or Chicago or San Francisco, and places where people have great accessibility to lots of amazing programming. And thinking about a lot of the future programming with the library and the other work that I'm doing actually happening in small towns that actually don't have access to archival institutions, to libraries, to other things that we have a plentiful access to. So even if people are not coming to them, if people want to come to them, they're available, versus if you go to another place in another part of the country, literally the institutions don't exist. And so how do we actually create these mobile and ephemeral institutions that can become sort of like jumping off points for people to think about how they're built in their neighborhoods, but also just to give people an opportunity to engage with them in one instance. And I want to. The last thing is this notion that you brought up about softness as a precursor to violence was like, it's beautiful, not the violence, but thinking about the idea of like literally luring people into such like a beautiful way to encapsulate exactly what you're talking about, right? So whether this is through like soft advertisement that uses very beautiful colors and strategic graphic design to lure people into a particular type of consumerism that is actually detrimental to their like financial wealth and just like livelihood is very important to think about, and it's part of the work that I'm interested in and thinking about things related to media literacy and design literacy. How do we actually get people to enjoy the things that they're engaging with every day? Beautiful design, beautiful topography, but also to be able to dissect literally what is happening when they're engaging with that at a psychological level, and just at a very basic visual level. And so that work is just beginning, but it is. You just like, you need to write this down. It's like such a beautiful way to like softness as a precursor to violence, right? Like the way that we are literally lured into these soft moments, and then as soon as you get comfortable and you let down your guard, then you are becoming complicit in something that you had not intended to become complicit in.
Hello, that was brilliant. Thank you very much. My name's Janine. I'm going to be cheeky and ask two questions. My first question is about blackness and how do we have a conversation in blackness that's on a global kind of level. So blackness in conversation with Europe, blackness in conversation with the continent, the Caribbean, Latinx. And do you draw from any kind of references, practices, knowledges, in particular indigenous knowledges, kind of outside of the American context? And then the second question is about the politics of pleasure and desire, and how do we kind of talk about your black school, your kind of artistic practice as a pleasurable practice, something that builds intimacy and touch and consent in a way that our bodies don't necessarily are kind of publicly shown and allowed to show, and how do you dismantle that in the museum context where often you can't touch shit? So yeah, those are my two questions.
Oh, there's so much and there's so little time. I'll start with the question around blackness, because one of the things that's most exciting for me to talk about is the a million different ways that black people exist in the world. And there's this thing that Gwendolyn Brooks said, is that we occur everywhere, which is such a beautiful statement to me. Like literally, you can find me like you can find a black person permutating or being black in all these different contexts. And what does it mean to honor that wide variation in ways that doesn't reduce rigor or nuance of like lived experience, because it's more convenient for us to have like a nice consolidated fixed understanding of what black people are. And so I lived on and off in South Africa for a little while. I first went there on study abroad, then went back to do a Fulbright, and I was supposed to do research, and I kind of did research, but I actually just like hung out with like dope people for like a long time. And one of the most beautiful things to me is there are 11 official languages in South Africa, two of which, one is English, one is Afrikaans, and there are 9 indigenous African languages. And I was like, so like, this is so dope, y'all have 9 languages. And they're like, no, this is just the 9 languages that have become official. There are literally other dialects and permutations, the way that we speak and engage with each other, that didn't even make it to this official list. And so thinking about language and vernacular as this way that's like very beautiful and interesting to me. When I first went to South Africa, there was an immediate ability for me to connect. And my immediate response to that was like, oh my God, we're such the same. And then also had to pull back to like, yo, but we're not. And that's also came beautiful. And so thinking about the ways in which like, when I see my brothers back home there, there's this moment of connection. There's also this moment of disconnect, and both of those moments being deeply beautiful. And how us honoring that is not honoring that for the purpose of articulating to white people that we are different and look how great and different we are, but as a reminder to ourselves, because I think it's very easy for us to fall into ourselves to say that we are not different, that we are all the same, and how violent analogy is, and how violent the notion of sameness is, and how I just really love, like, you can go anywhere in the United States and just find black people being black so many different ways. You can go anywhere in South Africa to find us being black in so many different ways. And it's to me like the most deeply spiritual reminder of like infinity, and the density of like our literal blackness that people have often reduced to like a singular line. Like it's like a refusal of that. And with regards to pleasure and desire and intimacy, one of the things that was important for me is that literally every single thing in the space, with the exception of the stuff on the wall, could be touched, and that was important to me because I struggled with attention a lot in school, and often got in trouble for like walking outside when I saw a bird because I thought the bird was more interesting than the teacher at the time. And so for me, it was super important to have things that had fabrics that were literally calming, that could become a moment of like returning to a safe space, returning to a moment of like calm, to literally be able to sit where you wanted, to touch everything, to make photocopies, to draw, to write, and thinking about pleasure is not as a luxury, but as like a necessity. And what does it mean to invite people to that? And what does it mean to allow people to sort of like spread out in the space and spend as much time? You can stay there until closing if you want. There have been people who've stayed until closing, but also recognizing that even all of that softness and that moment and all that pleasure is still under surveillance. And so what does it mean also that you're enjoying this space while under surveillance? And how do we actually create private spaces for people to enjoy that level of intimacy, and be able to create that level of intimacy in their own homes as well?
I forgot the question. Oh, blackness.
Blackness.
I had the same experience when I visited Africa. Everybody I was with was like, "We're so connected. We have so much in common." And I was like, wait, y'all had this serious? I had the exact opposite. I mean, true, we are so connected. Like that's no debating that. But I saw all of our differences. So like that, I mean, we all saw it, but I was like overwhelmed by the differences when growing up in the South and then going to the continent. I was like, wow, like our experiences are so different and based on the context we're in. Um, so in the exhibition, um, it's referencing Cuba. We talk about we talked about Fanon a lot in the first workshop with the youth. So yeah, we are pulling from like the knowledge that is being exchanged across the diaspora. Pleasure. Yeah, that's so complicated, man. Our pleasure politics, like that's so much a symptom of our colonization of our minds and of our bodies, you know. So yeah, that's something I'm thinking about personally, like where does all this come from, you know? Either whether it's attraction or repulsion, you know, what's beneath all of that? Um, I don't have any answers.
When you said pleasure, the first thought that came to me took me back to what Joseph has been working around a lot, which is Black style, and a thing that I think we try to do in designing our workshops and in just connecting with students. Um, there's so much pleasure in Blackness, in Black culture, and there's so little formal art training happening in schools. But one thing that we can always kind of count on connecting with is fashion. So even if you're in a classroom and people are like art, right, you just gotta go to right. I don't know how to draw. I don't know how to paint. But you just gotta go to the sister that's got her hair like in the like worm rollers that are purple that like match the scarf that she's got tied over them that coordinate with the flip flop. And once you know start to praise that and elevate those things that are not typically being praised and elevated in a classroom space, it opens up the creative means of making work, and it also creates a vibe of pleasure, right? Just this sort of familial sense that I think we try to bring to the classroom. So much of both of our personal experiences. How do you acquire this information to begin with? My father's a Black Studies professor. I didn't learn any of this from. I had one teacher for the 4th and 5th grade, Miss Black, coincidentally, who I'm still in touch with. But outside of that, you know, all of my knowledge of the diaspora, all of activism histories, that comes from my father, that comes from learning at home. And there's a familiarity, there's a comfort, there's laughter, there's softness, there's emotion, there's all of that present. And how do we allow for that in the way that we come into class, in the way that we design a space. And then how do we take that further, right? Because there's also a lot that's present in our Black culture in America and abroad that we need to be moving away from. There's a lot of chauvinism that we need to be moving away from. There's a lot of shutting down of dealing with emotions or acknowledging that we have depression, right, that we need to be moving away from. So I think we try to be very proactive about that also. Maybe up there.
Oh, it is on. Thank you for all that brilliance and history that I feel like we needed collectively. And I have a question because I feel like it's in there, but I haven't visited the fifth floor, so I want to just dig a little bit. Is that the two people I've heard reference explicitly have been UP Newton and Che, and hearing more, how do we move, I feel like, from these like iconic figures that are usually very masculinist, and the Black Panther Party even had a critique of like pushing UEP Newton and also pushing all these images of a singular vision of what freedom could look like. So how do we move towards those collective stories of the people who are already doing that work, but whose names we would never remember? How are we honoring them and really thinking about this collectivity in this extent it existed, and also how are we pushing, because I also hear you referencing the food programs and libraries and even sickle cell anemia, which many of these people, most of this labor is considered feminine labor. So how are you also thinking about the spaces of radicalism in a way that moves from the masculine, or in the way that honors masculinity, but in a different way?
Thank you. 2 stamps first. That's a good question. So many things. The first thing is that I need to shout out Gertrude Wilkes, who was the person who did start Nairobi Schools, even though her name gets lost a lot, and even I lost it in that moment. One thing that's been important to me about building out the library space was not telling people who they should pay attention to, but providing opportunities to unfold and look at things over time. And so one of the things I mentioned in the presentation is that in that space, you'll have a chapbook that was published by a bunch of Berkeley High students next to a Mary Baraka book, which could also be next to an excerpt of like the students up in Buffalo, New York, Black students who in their BSU started a movement to reform their schools. And so for me, it's important to have the footnotes of history actually be next to the people who often get a lot of space. And so there's a very particular reason why all those things are existing at the same time in the same space next to each other, because in a typical library, those things would be in segregated parts of the library. These are the things that are the major histories that we care about, and these are the minor notes, or they wouldn't even be in the library because they're so hyper local that they would be in a special collection that's locked away somewhere. And so thinking about the ways that we organize knowledge and information, particularly in libraries, to allow things that traditionally don't rub up against each other to like fill all the fills at the same time with each other. And so one thing that was really interesting to me during one of the library hours was that there was a woman who came in who picked up a book, and in the book she found her uncle's name, and her uncle was this person, her great uncle, who had taught himself how to read during slavery. And what was really beautiful about that moment is that she had not expected to find that book, had not expected to find his name, and there was this interesting moment of discovery for her. That was a reminder that the people that we do often talk about with regards to slave revolts are obviously important, but also the people who taught themselves how to read being an important element of that as well. The people who like wash the clothes to make sure that people had uniforms and clothing are also hyper important. And there's an excerpt in one of the file folders about the kitchen table press, which, for folks who know, was a feminist press led by folks of color, women of color, who were really focused on this idea of not only producing materials or publishing materials by more well-known people. And this is one of the things in the acquisition process for this library, is that whenever I was searching for books, I constantly got all the Mary Barakas. I got all the texts of the big names, and it was so hard to find people who were not already having 15 pages long on Wikipedia. And so the acquisition process literally became hunting down things on eBay, the most marginalized things that I could possibly find to actually put in that space. And the other part of the acquisition process also is that as I'm coming in contact with people, also including, for example, an anthology that was published in 2018 by a Bronx school here as well. So having an acquisitions process that evolves and grows over time to accommodate the stories of people who would traditionally not be in those spaces. And then to your point around female gendered labor, I think it's such an amazing thing to bring up, because in most of the Ebony magazine articles that are talking about the schools, they're talking about the founders of the schools, the people who did this work of like opening school, or building the school, or doing these things, and then the women who actually were the teachers are not often mentioned in that context, or they're not the names that are mentioned in the title of the article. The women who are in charge of like designing textbooks and things like that are also not mentioned. And so I think it's an excellent point to think about as we are historicizing this particular moment, but also historicizing those past moments, making space for those women, and for those folks who just are not big names to actually live and to elaborate in that space. Thank you for that question.
I want to say, as soon as you started talking, it's a thing that we take very seriously and really try to structure around, of not being a Black education program that shoves bios down students' throats, right? That's become what Black History Month is, and it really feeds into like this very American individualized narrative that we have, in this constant seeking of a one savior leader, right? So that's why we begin with, what do you love about your community? What do you want to change about your community? And take the work from there, and take the history that we provide, really, and tailor it to what the students first say they want to get into. When we do have opportunities to do more sustained programming, we do include formal lectures, but of the 4 formal lectures that we have this summer, there's only one that has anything like a bio or a person's name in it, and that's Ida B. Wells, and connecting the anti-lynching campaign to the very similar work of the Black Lives Matter movement, which is started by all women. So yeah, same as I was saying before, I think we really try to push these conversations into a new generation, so that we're not repeating or kind of making things stale. And then I also just wanted to say that Joseph has put lavender ruffles over these images of Huey Newton holding this gun and doing all of those really static poses, right? Really trying to provide some sense of balance, and turn some things on their head, reimagine the way we consider these histories, and how we can best bring them forward without carrying the problematics that are present.
Yeah, we talk about the 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 popular image of the Panthers being patriarchal, and but the actual rank and file members being mostly women. And one of the pieces that I didn't talk about, but that was in the photographs, was a quote unquote painting that features a Panther mother and child, which is like an opportunity to get into that history that is often like, hard to uncover, deep but present. Mm.
Add one thing really quickly. I I feel like the reason why so many attempts at talking about Black people and Black history often rest on the laurels of like big names is because it's obviously the easiest thing to do, right? So if I can like pull out a Martin Luther King or a Malcolm X, it's much easier because I actually don't have to do any research and I don't have to do any work, and I can Google it really quickly. And so the harder, more rigorous work means to actually go to the footnotes, or the harder, more rigorous work means to do a hyper local focus, which allows for you to get into the nuance of like 15 years in this one particular town. And so I think one of the things that was brought up in the interview that we did before the show opened is like, what does it mean to actually slow down? To actually think about what it means to pay homage to the people who did not end up as those big names, but like, what do we actually learn from the minor, so-called minor characters of history, and what lessons can be learned about the fact that they never made it into textbooks. And there's a part of me that often wonders if that was the intention all the way, is that this moment of discovery where there is a desire for someone to discover this thing that they did, actually going through the intellectual rigor of figuring that out. But I think, again, this goes back to questions around commodification of Black histories and Black identity, where, again, it's much easier to present an individual character who's decontextualized and removed from any type of historical context, who saves everyone, because saviors are easy ways to sort of chart a future. But where it gets messy and problematic is that if that individual person is responsible for saving us, and that individual person is also responsible for failing us, and then that becomes deeply complicated and doesn't recognize the network of responsibility and complicity that all of us have in actually moving towards a messy but better future.
I mean, I just want to add that oftentimes one of the most influential figures in people's lives actually are their teachers, and particularly in the Black community, there's often a Black teacher historically that had some role. I know with my parents who grew up in the segregated South, Depression South, their teachers were really their role models in a way, and had profound effects on, the trajectories that people took. And my parents had an amazing art teacher who I actually met much, 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 much later on. And she really was this remarkable. She was Black. She was also Indigenous. She had this amazing biography. But she was like, she made jewelry. She painted. I mean, she was a brilliant person. And her impact, I think, on the lives and my aunts and uncles is profound because a number of them became artists. Some well known. And that person who you engage in that very intimate act, right, of being taught and sharing, can become that person. And a lot of times they are Black women, for example. And I think that has often been the history.
Last question. I want to thank all of our panelists this evening and all of you for your questions. There are lots of opportunities to see both the Black School and Kameelah still coming up in our program. The exhibition closes September 16th. And thank you so much, Mabel, for moderating this conversation.